Okay, let's talk about Chapter 2, Theories of Development. So, there are... Sorry, my PowerPoint's not moving forward. Come on. Whoop. Okay, so there are a bunch of different theories of why we develop how we develop. A theory is just a bunch of ideas that say, this is my idea for how something works. A theory is not proven. Once it's proven, then we say it's a law, and there's very few things that are in that category. So for instance, the law of gravity. Gravity is true everywhere. Gosh, that's... Okay, a little brighter, too bright, I don't know. So gravity is something that is proven. We don't need to worry about whether it is true everywhere. Like gravity works on Mars, it works on the next galaxy. Scientists are in no doubt that gravity is a real thing. So a theory has some amount of evidence behind it. It is not necessarily true, though. We think it may be true. It's a hypothesis, kind of, but it's a hypothesis with a lot of support, or some degree of support. Some theories are much better than other theories. Some theories really suck. But if it's a theory, then there's some evidence. Theory of evolution, some evidence, but not proven by any means. Otherwise, we would say it was a law. Now, some people with evolution, because this is a touchy subject, some people will say evolution is true. There's no doubt about it. They would be wrong. And that's really, it's an ignorant thing to say. It may be true that this is what a theory is. A theory may be true, but is not yet proven. So why do we have theories? Well, number one, they help us to get organized. We can understand something better. So for instance, you all have a theory about how to interact in the best way possible with your professor. If, let's say, you want a better grade, you all have a theory about how can I talk to Professor Harvey in the best way so that I get what I want. How do I get a boyfriend or a girlfriend? You have a theory about how that works. So it organizes what you're going to do in the future as well as information that comes in. So if she responds this way, then I know it means blah, 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 and I will react in a certain way according to my theory of how this relationship will work best. So it organizes ideas. It also organizes data that is coming in. And this is really important in human development because let's say, for instance, your 3-year-old has an imaginary friend. Is your 3-year-old crazy? Does your 3-year-old have a mental illness? Or is your 3-year-old perfectly normal? Well, you have to have a theory of how humans develop appropriately in order to be able to determine what is going on with your child. And according to every theory of human development I know about, it is normal to have imaginary friends up until 5, 6, maybe 7 years old. After that, it's usually a sign of mental illness. So don't worry about your 3-year-old, but do worry about your 13-year-old if they have an imaginary friend. Now, if you didn't have a theory of proper imaginary friend-child development, then you would just be left to sort of guess on your own of whether this is a problem or not. Now, theories have to be consistent, internally consistent, in order to be a good theory. Not all theories have that. Going back to evolution, for instance, this is one of the criticisms of the theory of evolution is that it is not internally consistent. So, for instance, Darwin said that for his theory to be true, there has to be tiny, tiny little step-like changes in organism development, and we haven't been able to prove that. We've seen big leaps in changes, but we haven't seen tiny stepwise changes. He also said that every part of an organism has to be able to function independently. There has to be a purpose for it independently without it needing other systems to be around in order for his theory to be true. We also haven't seen that. Freud. This is one of the issues with Freud. He's not internally consistent. He said certain things had to be true, and then he also said the opposite. Yeah, so issues with those theories. Also has to be falsifiable. Big criticism of Freud. Also a criticism of evolution, because we can't go back to Stone Age man and see if what Darwin said about him was true. Well, maybe in the future if we have a time machine, but at this point we cannot do that. So that makes it a weaker theory. That does not necessarily mean that it's not true. It just is a weakness of the theory. And also has to be supported by data. If you don't have any evidence, it's not really a theory, it's just a guess or maybe a hypothesis. So there has to be some data. Freud does have data behind his theory. You may have heard that Freud was crazy. We'll talk more about him in a bit. He's not crazy, but there's some issues with Freud. And Darwin evolution also has some evidence behind it, but neither of them are 100% proven. Otherwise, we would have the law of evolution or the law of Freud. So some things that we will be looking at in each theory. Each theory has an idea about, is it nature or nurture? Is it your genetics or is it your environment? Goodness versus badness. Are people naturally good or are people naturally bad? Now, religions also all have theories of how we develop. Hinduism, for instance, has a theory that we're all working towards goodness and becoming better people, and then we will be reincarnated and get more chances, either be reincarnated up if we lived a good life or reincarnated down. Eventually, if we're good, we'll get reincarnated into nirvana and just live in this void of emptiness, and somehow that's good. I don't know. But Christianity, for instance, says that we are all... Christianity is kind of a mix. We have natural tendencies towards evil, is what Christianity believes. That we all want to do things that are bad, but we all have the ability to fight against it, you could say. Humanism and psychology says that everybody wants to do good and life gets in the way sometimes. So each theory has an opinion, a different opinion on these areas. Are we actively or passively developing? So do I make choices in how I develop, or am I simply a victim of my environment? Politics has questions like this. So why are some people poor? Is it because we don't give them all the resources they need in life? Or is it because they choose to live life like that and they choose not to better themselves? Big argument. Continuity versus discontinuity. So do we have a continual development or do we have stages of development? Like growth, we have growth spurts. So that would be a discontinuous development. Are the changes in us quantitative or qualitative? And I think all theories would agree that it's both. So quantitative means quantity. I can measure the changes, like your height. I can measure how tall you are. Qualitative is like, what is the change in happiness across the lifespan? It's very difficult to measure happiness. Some people try, but it's qualitative. It's more of almost like a feel. It's more subjective. It's hard to prove. And then, is change universal or context specific? So does everybody change in the same way? So for instance, we know puberty happens no matter what society or time period in history you're in, assuming like you're not starving or something. Whereas maturity, like emotional maturity, is very context specific. It's semi-universal too, like people mature, but there are a lot of environmental factors, like if you're spoiled, if you were locked in a closet for the first 20 years of your life, obviously your emotional maturity is going to be delayed. So anyhow, every theory has an idea about these different factors. So as we talk about different developmental theories, we'll be talking a lot about nature and nurture and active or passive development and so on. Now, the first theory, and a theory that we will talk about many times across this course, is Freud's psychodynamic theory. So Freud was a Jewish man living in Austria, Vienna, Austria. And Vienna was sort of like the place to be, sort of like LA or New York or something. Like if you were somebody important, you were living in Vienna, Austria. Probably a lot of you haven't ever heard of that place now, but back in the day, it was the place to be. And Freud lived from the late 1800s to the mid 1900s. So I think he died in 1960, I think. And he had to escape Nazi Germany, or Nazi Austria, I guess you could say. Obviously, he was Jewish, so he was not well liked by the Third Reich. So a lot of people, you've probably heard Freud was crazy, Freud was sex obsessed, Freud was a crackhead, you might have heard that. There is some truth, like most stereotypes, there's a nugget of truth to it that has been blown all out of proportion to the point where it's now inaccurate. So Freud, yes, he did do cocaine. However, there was a time period, a short period of time, where everybody sort of did cocaine. It was just, it was a fad for about a decade, and people did not realize how bad it was for you. Freud actually wrote a book saying cocaine is wonderful, it's the next best thing, it's the cure for depression, and everybody should try it, it makes you feel so good. And then he very quickly after that wrote another book saying, sorry, I made a mistake, this is really bad. His best friend, whom he got to use cocaine, died of an overdose. He got his fiancée hooked on it, although she did eventually get off of it. Freud also got off. Yeah, so, and within about 10 years, cocaine was made illegal in Europe. So, and by the way, he never did crack, because crack was invented in the 1980s, and he was more like the 1880s, okay? So definitely not crack. Is he sex obsessed? Kind of. He had talked a lot about sex, a lot of weird things, like kids want to have sex with their, boys want to have sex with their mom, but they're afraid to because they think dad might come in the middle of the night and castrate them, cut off their testicles. So yes, that was a Freudian idea, which is kind of weird. But Freud also, he lived in the Victorian era, which was very sexually oppressed. Like if you were a female, you were having issues, you'd go into the doctors and they'd give you a doll and they would say, point to the place where you're having pain or whatever, because Lord forbid you say ankle, you'll probably faint. And there was fainting couches everywhere, and women often wore necklaces with smelling salts to try to get them to come out of their faint. It was a really weird time period. And in this super sexually repressed time period, Freud was working with women who had been sexually molested. So it's not all that crazy that he came up with crazy sexualized sort of ideas. And remember, Freud was basically the first psychologist. He was the first psychologist that made sense. And he had theories of everything. Like he came up with a theory of how children develop, even though he didn't really work with children. So he was a genius, but he did get some things wrong. And that's not surprising considering he had no foundation to work off of. He just came up with all of these ideas on his own. Let me move this because the sun is glaring. Okay. So what else about Freud? He came up with this idea that the mind has separate components, and we use his terminology all the time, like, oh, I did that unconsciously, or maybe in my subconscious, I don't like her, and that's why I did X, Y, and Z. And that's a Freudian term. So you see the iceberg. Freud said our mind was like an iceberg. There's the part you can see, that's the conscious, that's what we're aware of. Then if you were standing on the edge of the iceberg and you look down, then you can see the iceberg under the water for a few feet, depending on how clear the water is, until it disappears. The pre-conscious is what you can still see. So it's unconscious, but with some effort you can see it. You can see what's going on in your mind. And then under that, in the deep water, is the unconscious, which is, I have no idea what's going on in my mind. Something's functioning in there, but I don't have conscious awareness of it. And if you see the iceberg, only the tip of the iceberg is above the water. Most of the iceberg is underwater. So most of what's going on in us psychologically and emotionally is unconscious, according to Freud. So he's the one who came up with those ideas. We use Freudian terms all the time without realizing it. A Freudian slip, things like that. So even though Freud kind of gets this rap as being crazy, we use his terms all the time in daily life. So he said much of our behavior is influenced by the unconscious, and in the unconscious we have this conflict that's going on. So our desires as well as the rules we have in life are constantly in conflict. We want to do things, but maybe it's not, we don't believe that we should be doing it. Now, the more extreme that conflict gets, the more mental illness we have. So that's how he explained why people have anxiety or psychopathy type of problems, why they go crazy. So let's say I want to have sex with this person, but I was raised in a religious household where I believe sex before marriage is wrong. So the more I have this desire and the stronger those rules were that I was raised with, the more anxiety, the more conflict, the more mental illness will arise out of this unconscious conflict. And he called his treatment psychoanalysis. So his theory is psychodynamic theory, the energy of the mind or the energy of the soul. Psyche really means soul. And then the way he treated people was he analyzed their psyche. He tried to figure out what's going on in the unconscious. What is that conflict? And then if we can fix that conflict, the mental illness will go away. And another thing to remember about Freud is he was actually a medical doctor. He was an MD. He wasn't a psychologist because there were not training schools for psychology. And he started getting these women with hysteria, which is basically severe anxiety. And back then they believed hysteria was a medical issue. Hysteria, like hysterectomy, refers to the uterus. So they believed that anxiety in women was caused by a wandering womb. So your uterus dislodged and floated around your body, and that caused anxiety. Right? Give Freud some credit because the time period he was in was just crazy. All right, so this is just another picture. You've got the conscious, the pre-conscious, the unconscious. So your normal awareness, things that are easily brought to consciousness, and then your hidden thoughts and desires. And the more conflict in that unconscious level, the more mental illness you have. Now, another thing Freud said about our personality is that it's broken down into three areas: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the home to our sexual and aggressive drives. It's the selfish part of us. It's the part that says, I want this. And the id does not care about consequences. It only cares about what it wants. So the id sometimes wants crazy things. It wants to commit incest, wants to rob a bank, wants to take drugs. Things that you're like, I would never want to do those things. But unconsciously, you don't really control your id. Unconsciously, the id it wants what it wants. It sees, you're watching a movie and it sees drug use and the id goes, oh, that looks fun. And the more rules you have, which would be the superego, the home to morality and conscious, the stronger your superego, the more anxiety you feel about the fact that how could I possibly think about taking drugs or sleeping with my sibling or robbing a bank or killing somebody. How could I possibly think that? Well, because the id doesn't care about what's right or wrong. It simply cares about what would bring it instantaneous pleasure. And if I'm pissed off at somebody, then killing them would be nice. I mean, let's be honest, there's some people that you might consciously even have that desire. But the superego is horrified by that. So the more extreme the difference between the id and the superego, the more upset you're going to be, and that comes out in mental illness, according to Freud. Okay, so it's sort of like the devil and the angel on your shoulder. The id is saying, let's do this, and the superego is saying, no, how could we possibly think about doing something like that? Then you are in the middle. You are the ego. So you are the referee between the id and the superego. And this is what we say is governed by the reality principle, where you say, look, yeah, I want to do this. I shouldn't do that, but let's come up with a solution. So you want somebody to have a strong ego. According to Freud, being egotistical would be a compliment. We sort of misuse it now to say it's more... What we refer to as egotistical nowadays is really, Freud would have said, is a very strong id. That's selfish, only cares about itself. That's the id. So an idiot, basically, is what they're saying. You want, like in your child, you want to develop a strong ego. The ability to be aware of what you want, be aware of what's right, but also to make decisions. Like maybe today, okay, I've got an exam coming up. I really want to go hang out with my friend. That's the id. And the superego saying, no, you need to study. You need to be a good student. Well, the ego would say, I think I'm ready for the test. So, or maybe I need to relax and I'm stressing myself out too much. So let's go with what the id says today. Or, yeah, the superego's right, I need to study more. So sorry, id, but you don't get what you want today. So you want to be able to make good decisions, and that is the job of the ego. Freud, of course, looked at how people develop. He basically had the first good theory of personality development, which some of it, by the way, is still supported by research. Some of it's not, but we'll get into that. So he said for personality development, early experiences affect long-term development, which was like, oh, I can't believe that. During this time period, people really didn't care about childhood. And Freud's brought us back to kids are important, and the life that children experience is really important. So we can't abuse kids. We have to be aware of the importance of childhood. It was just weird to think that people weren't focused on that before. I mean, there was always people who cared about kids, but as a society, people just didn't really give a rip about children for a couple centuries. So he said children move through 5 stages, and we'll get to those stages next. But the stages, the reason why we develop through the stages is because of conflict between the id and the superego. So that's not only, it's not necessarily a bad thing according to Freud. That's actually a reason why we develop and become better people, as long as we resolve those conflicts well. Yeah, okay. So you can watch this video on your own. Right, that just goes through the defense stages, so make sure that you go through the PowerPoint and you watch that, because I'm not going to go over that in this video. So here's the 5 stages, Freud's psychosexual stages. You have the oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital stage, and those are all for certain ages. So the oral stage is birth to 1 year, and the developmental issue here is breastfeeding. Oral is the mouth. So we get pleasure, and Freud said we got sexual pleasure from putting things in our mouth, but he doesn't mean like, oh, this 6-month-old is getting off on, breastfeeding. It's not what he meant. He believes sexual pleasure was different at different ages. So as an adult, sexual pleasure is what we think of as sex. As a child, sexual pleasure is more like, basically just pleasure. Just take off the sexual part and it makes more sense, okay? Remember, Freud was back in the 1800s, early 1900s, and he's from a different country. There's a lot of interpretation we have to do. He did not mean that children were interested in sex as much as just that there's a certain drive we have that eventually develops into full-blown sex that we have at any age. So anyhow, oral stage, it's about putting stuff in your mouth, breastfeeding, toys, whatever. And if children were deprived of these experiences, then it's going to cause problems in the development. They'll get stuck or fixated at this stage. And there is research that supports that. So breastfeeding, your child's not going to be screwed up if they're not breastfed. But there are a lot of advantages to it. And certainly children have to have toys so that they can stick stuff in their mouth. That is an important part of infancy. And if they're denied that stimulation of more of their mind than anything, then they will become intellectually and emotionally delayed. So he was right about that. The next stage is anal stage. So this is 1 to 3 years old. And he said the important thing was potty training. So kids had control of their body. They're making decisions for themselves. So it was more than just their focus. See, this is where Freud gets really weird. They get sexual pleasure from control of their anus. Sounds horrible, but he's meaning that their pleasure in life, their enjoyment at that age is that they have control of their body, which is for the first time in their life. They're actually in control not only of their body, but of their life. Because what happens when baby says, I have to go to the bathroom? You stop everything in order to go rush that kid to the toilet to try to get them potty trained. And it's amazing to them. All of a sudden, I can make mom and dad do whatever I want. It's phenomenal to them. Okay, so the anal stage is about control. Phallic stage, 3 to 6 years old, is about gender identity. So something that's phallic shaped is symbolic of a penis. So this is not about true sexuality. This is sort of symbolic sexuality, which is what we would say is gender. So they're starting to understand, I'm a boy or I'm a girl. This is, what boys are like. This is what girls are like. And this develops from 3 to 6 years old. And this, by the way, is very strongly supported by research. Children do not start to even develop gender identity until 2.5, 3 years old. It is not fully developed until 6 years old. So sometimes you hear of, my child by 1-year-old knew that they were supposed to be the opposite gender. That's not psychologically possible because they don't even begin to understand gender until 2.5 years old, and they don't fully understand it until around 6, 7 years old. Now, this is also the stage when we see the Oedipus and the Electra complex. So the story of Oedipus Rex, it's a Greek tragedy, Oedipus was a prince of Thebes, I believe, and the fortune teller, the oracle, came by when mom was pregnant and said, this kid's bad news, he's going to grow up and kill his father, you need to get rid of him. So they had an abortion, which back then means you have the baby, and then you take the baby to the forest, you put the baby upside down and nail its poor little chubby feet to a tree. That's what they did back then. And then you just leave them to die. And it's illegal if you come across a child nailed to a tree, it's illegal to take the child down off the tree. So Oedipus, he's hanging there, dying as a baby. This hunter from the neighboring kingdom comes through, sees the kid, feels sorry for them, takes them to the king and queen that he works for, who are childless, and they raise Oedipus as their own kid. Eventually he grows up, he goes on a road trip, he's riding his chariot down a one chariot lane road. This other guy's coming by with his chariot. They get mad at each other because neither will move out of the other's way. I mean, he's a prince, why would he do that? They get into a fight, he kills the other guy. Then Oedipus keeps going, so what does he care? He's a prince. And he goes to this other kingdom where the queen, she's an older lady, but she's a cougar, so they kind of hit it off. Her husband has recently been murdered. So they get married, they have some children. Eventually, the fortune teller, the oracle, comes by and says, this guy, Oedipus, he's your son that you're married to. So now his kids are also his siblings, and I told you to get rid of that kid. He was trouble. He's the one that murdered your husband. Yeah, so really screwed up family. And there's also a sequel, too, if you're interested. So that's the Oedipus complex. Freud said boys want to be in a relationship with their mom. They want to have sex with their mom. They want to marry her. And you do often hear little kids say to their opposite sex parent, I'm going to marry you when I grow up. It's really typical for 3 to 6 years old. Now, do they actually want to have sex with that parent? I don't think so, and that's not supported by research. But Freud said what happened is these boys were afraid to make a move on mom because they were afraid that dad would come in the middle of the night and castrate them. So they had castration anxiety. And so instead, they identify with dad's gender. I'm going to grow up to be like dad so I can get a woman like mom. And that is actually really true. We do gender identify with our same-sex parent. And then we also, as adults, tend to be attracted to somebody like our opposite-sex parent. Okay, so there's some truth to what Freud had to say, although castration anxiety is not supported by research. Now, masturbation also begins at 3 to 6 years old. It is not unusual. There, of course, is argument about whether it is an okay thing to do morally or not. If you are Christian, there is nothing in the Bible that says masturbation is wrong. There is a scene where... trying to remember the details. So back in ancient Hebrew culture, if your husband died, if you're a woman, your husband dies, then his brother will marry you in order to keep taking care of you. And so in this story, second brother comes along, marries this woman, but he doesn't want to be married to her, so he masturbates onto the ground as a sign of disrespect towards the woman, and God gets mad at him. So that was interpreted as you shouldn't masturbate, even though that's not what the story is about at all. So that's sort of where the Christian tradition of looking on masturbation negatively came from. So just FYI, you can decide for yourself whether you think it's bad or not, but it's actually a pretty normal part of human life. All right, so anyhow, 3 to 6 years old, phallic stage is gender identity. There is a video on here. Again, I'm not going to play it while I'm doing this video, but watch it for yourself. It's about a kid who is identifying as an opposite sex. So it's a little boy who wants to be a female. So think about gender identity, how it starts around 2.5, 3 years old and ends at 6 or 7. It's fully developed by 6 or 7. Look at this and decide for yourself, is it possible that this kid is identifying as the opposite gender? Why or why not, according to how we know gender identity develops, and decide whether you believe this kid is a transsexual kid or if they have gender identity disorder, and mom and dad or society or whatever has screwed up this kid's gender identity development. Okay, that's for you to decide on your own. All right, next stage, latency stage. This is 6 years old to puberty. Latency means hidden. Not a lot is going on in this stage. All that libido and sexual energy has decreased. It's a very calm emotional stage, and that's why this is a great age for children to focus on academics and learning and stuff, because there's not a lot of emotional angst. So then we have puberty. Puberty hits and everything goes crazy again, right? So this is the genital stage. Now genital, you're talking like the actual genital, scientific term. So this is real sex, not just gender identity, symbolic sexuality, but real sex. So this is when people get interested in relationships, having sex, and so on. Yeah, okay, so those are basically his stages. Now Freud said personality development goes until roughly 5, 6, 7, and then there's a little bit of personality development after that through the teenage years, but then you're done. Personality set in stone. Not everybody agreed with that. Erik Erikson, by the way, let me find him. Okay, this is your next PowerPoint. Erik Erikson was Freud's student, and he said, no, personality development continues throughout the lifespan. So he has 8 stages of personality development. Freud had 5 psychosexual stages. Erikson had 8, which did not focus on sex at all. He said first stage is trust versus mistrust, which is very similar to the oral stage. Am I going to be taken care of? When I'm hungry, does mom breastfeed me? Do I get the toys and care that I want? It's broader than Freud's oral stage. But is the world trustworthy or not? Do I get my needs taken care of or not? Then autonomy versus shame and doubt, which is very much like Freud's anal stage. So it's about control of your body, control of the world around you. Then he added initiative versus guilt in preschool stage. So can I take the initiative to do my own things? Can I make my own decisions? Or do I feel bad about making my own decisions? Do I feel guilty for not doing what other people want? Industry versus inferiority. So now you have school-age children. This is basically the latent stage where Freud said nothing interesting is going on. But Erikson said, no, this is when children develop their academic identity. Am I smart? Am I capable? Can I do things? Or do I develop an inferiority complex? Teenage years is identity versus role confusion. So who am I? What am I supposed to do in my life? Young adulthood is sort of like Freud's genital stage. So intimacy versus isolation. Can I have relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, or do I become a solitary, isolated person? Middle age, this is the midlife crisis. Generativity versus stagnation. Have I generated? Have I achieved my goals? If not, do I feel like I've stagnated and now I have mental illness issues or mental health issues from that? And then old age was also a personality development. Do I feel like I lived a good life? Did I contribute to the next generations? Or was I selfish and didn't do anything good for the world? Sort of like the Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge. Did I live a good life? So if you had somebody coming into therapy and you're an Eriksonian therapist, if you had a teenager, you'd be looking at identity versus role confusion and maybe intimacy versus isolation. If you had somebody who's 40 years old, then a lot of their issues are going to revolve around generativity versus stagnation. If you had a preschooler, then it would be autonomy versus shame and doubt, or initiative versus guilt. So this helps you, this is a theory, it organizes data and ideas that helps you to understand what issues somebody is going through in that area of their life. This is just a chart comparing Freud and Erikson, so you can look through that on your own. Now, some of the strengths of Freud is that he brought up the identity crisis of the teenage years, which is very much supported by research. He also said we're much more rational and adaptive, that Freud was sort of like we're instinctual creatures. We just go through these things without having knowledge of it. It's in our unconscious. And Erikson said, no, we think about these things. We're aware of the stages that we're in. And he also said that we go through these stages because it's biological, but also because of social interaction. Blah, blah, blah. Now, like Freud, Erikson is sometimes vague, very difficult to test and prove. And he didn't explain why we develop through these stages. He just said these stages exist. Now, learning theory is another theory of why we develop. Behaviorism, you learned about this in Psych 101. Basically, it's saying that we behave as a result of stimuli in our environment. So I have anxiety because of how my environment shaped me. I'm brave because of how my environment shaped me. behaviorism really ignored the biological, which is one of its weaknesses. Behaviorists believed that we were born a tabula rasa. So that means blank slate in Latin, and we were just empty vessels and our environment fills us. Now that is not true. We know that biology, we are born with certain biological predispositions. Some people have very sensitive nervous systems and they're more prone to anxiety or depression. Other people have very insensitive nervous systems and they're more prone to antisocial type of issues. So, fear, things that we're interested in, a lot of this is biologically programmed. So, but that doesn't mean the environment isn't also influencing us. So they had some of it right, but not the whole thing. So then you have, classical conditioning, stimulus response, unconditioned, conditioned stimulus and response. You probably remember a lot of this from Psych 101, but I will review it briefly in the next video.